For all you boppers out there in the big city, all you street people with an ear for the action, I've been asked to relay a request from
Dumela, welcome back to Straights'N'Curves episode 3, where we'll be doing a brief overview of Golden Age Superman and the period of time and the censorship which resulted in the implications of the character changes that happened to him in that period of time in his brief run in the late 30s. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening back, all 5 of you. It's always much appreciated. So I hope you're having a good day, and if not, I hope it turns around soon. Enjoy. The story of Superman creators Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster is far too big and nuanced to cover in this video, but I would recommend the book Boys of Steel by Mark Nobleman, which covers the lives of the artist-writer duo and their history with their creation, The Man of Tomorrow. Nobleman is also the same author of Bill the Boy Wonder, the secret co-creator of Batman, which the wonderful documentary Batman and Bill is based upon. Both the book and documentary chronicle the long hidden contributions of Batman co-creator Bill Finger. And while I haven't yet read Boys of Steel, I would expect it to be as thorough and thoughtful as Batman and Bill, giving a deep dive into Shuster and Siegel's time with Superman. The short version of events is that Jerry and Joe met in Cleveland, both from working, poor-class immigrant Jewish families, and became friends in their school days, eventually becoming the writer-artist duo that would sell comic book stories in the early 30s to National Allied Publications, now DC Comics. They also worked on New Fun, the landmark first comic book series to consist of original stories rather than reprinting newspaper strips. And eventually they crafted a story about a bulletproof man who was devoted to helping and protecting the downtrodden, everyday good people who get lost, squeezed between the sides of corrupt law enforcement, organized crime, and the evil men can do. The era Golden Age Superman debuted was hard times, as the Depression was ending and World War II was beginning. So not exactly the most joyous period of time. It was a unique, tense transition that would alter the world and the world of art in ways that, like the story of Shuster and Siegel, is far too immense and detailed for this simple video. So I'll just say, thank you Disney for helping us get anime. In describing Golden Age Superman, I find it best to start at his design, his look. Shuster designed Superman's look after strongmen and powerlifters of the 20s and 30s. Shuster invoked the symbolism of power, strength, by using imagery that represented those qualities a great deal in that period of time. This design choice would prove to be an influence that would spread to all comic studio properties from Shuster's era to today. Even artists who don't know the history or the why of Shuster's design are influenced. It's an effective design idea. So when you hear or see someone thrashing Shuster's design, taking issue, talking about some panties on the outside, you can tell them to take their panties out of a bunch and read a history book. This Superman has a low tolerance for villainy, a deep sense of compassion, and a strong sense of protectiveness for the good people of Metropolis. He has a hearty approach to tackling danger, a real kind of get up and go about him when he risks his life to help the working class, going face to face with the mob, arms dealers, scam artists, the elite aristocracy, and corrupt cops. The first issue Superman has him saving a woman on death row, falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit, by bringing with him the real culprit with a signed confession to boot. Then him literally bursting through the door like the Kool-Aid Man, fighting through the corrupt mayor's forces to get him to call off the execution before an innocent woman is killed. This is just a small sample of how Superman is decisive and no nonsense when it comes to defending the innocent. And the disguises. My guy Golden Age Superman, the retro Man of Steel, is all in on the disguises. You'd think he was 007 with all the costumes he puts on. There was an issue where there were a bunch of rich crooks who were endangering miners working in a very unsafe tunnel, coal mine, that had issues of collapsing, poor tools, being underpaid, and Superman went undercover as a miner and set up a situation in which the rich investors would find, and Superman himself would find themselves trapped in the mine, and he let them stay there in the mine until they saw how they were endangering the miners and had a change of heart, seeing the error of their ways. How this Superman handles his duality is more him discovering a problem as Clark Kent, forming a plan, then addressing it as Superman, rather than dropping everything as Clark Kent when trouble arises, and whoosh, there he goes. He tends to think before he acts, as opposed to being a monster of the weak fighter type of character. He was anti-establishment and a social crusader. Sounds pretty relevant, wouldn't you say? Now, to talk about this particular era of Superman, 1930s, is to also talk about censorship in that period of time, as the industry of comics was still in its infancy in terms of discovering how profitable it would be. So this is where things also get a bit tangled. And again, this is another portion of the Golden Age Superman story that is very detailed and will require its own video, not just because of the nature of the censorship, but also because of the social impact, the political climate at the time that facilitated this first major wave of comic book censorship that crippled the industry in ways that it still hasn't recovered. Nothing happens in a vacuum. The story of censorship in American comics in the 1940s, 1950s is a lot bigger than just the comics affected. So what I'm going to do is read for you some excerpts from an article that I will link in the description below by George Sergey on the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund website called The Amazing Adventure of the Man of Steel and the Psychotic Censor, Superman vs. Dr. Worm. Well, that's my version. The original title actually says The Amazing Adventure of the Man of Steel and the Psychiatric Censor, Superman vs. Dr. Wortham. Can you tell how I feel about the not-so-good doctor? I'm not going to read the whole article, but the broad strokes is a look at the causes of the dramatic character shift of Superman, and by extension comics as a whole, giving quotes and such to give context to what has happened in that time. By the time 1940 rolled around, Superman's star was on the rise, and he was finding himself licensed out to all sorts of things like cereal, radio, and gasoline. And with this kind of exposure comes corporate expectations based on their desire to avoid controversy and generate profit. Remember, the popularity of Superman set a precedent that hadn't been the norm for comic books before. So in early 1940, new DC editor Whitney Ellsworth institutes a moral code, which Les Daniels explains in his book, Superman, The Complete History. Amongst Ellsworth's most important tasks were determining a proper code of conduct for Superman. In the first newspaper adventures, Superman had deliberately torn the wings off a plane full of bad guys. Such melodramatics worried Harry Doningfield. Superman was becoming a valuable property, one that appealed to a younger audience, and the publisher was anxious to avoid any repetition of the censorship problems associated with his early pulp magazines, such as The Lurid Spicy Detective. It was up to Ellsworth to impose tight editorial controls on Jerry Siegel. Henceforth, Superman would be forbidden to use his powers to kill anyone, even a villain. A copy of DC's editorial standards, in the form of a memo by Ellsworth, was submitted to Congress as part of the testimony of Gunnar Dubois, editor-director of the Child Study Association of America, during the 1954 hearing on juvenile delinquency. And if you kindly look at the screen, you will see the memo reads, Exhibit number 21, National Comics Publications Incorporated, Editorial Policy for Superman DC Publications. Number 1. Sex. The inclusion of females in stories is specifically discouraged. Women, when used in plot structure, should be secondary in importance and should be drawn realistically, without exaggeration of feminine physical qualities. 2. Language. Expressions having reference to the deity are forbidden. Heroes and other good persons must use basically good English, though some slang and other colloquialisms may be judiciously employed. Poor grammar is used only by crooks and villains, and not always by them. 3. Bloodshed. Characters, even villains, should never be shown bleeding. No character should be shown being stabbed or shot or otherwise assaulted, so that the sanguinary result is visible. Acts of mayhem are specifically forbidden. The picturization of dead bodies is forbidden. Torture. The use of chains, whips, and other such devices is forbidden. Anything having a sexual or sadistic implication is forbidden. Kidnapping. The kidnapping of children is specifically forbidden. The kidnapping of women is discouraged and must never have any sexual implication. Killing. Heroes should never kill a villain, regardless of the depth of the villainy. The villain, if he is to die, should do so as a result of his own evil machinations. A specific exception may be made in the case of duly constituted officers of the law. The use of lethal weapons by women, even villainous women, is discouraged. Number 7. Crime. Crime should be depicted in all cases as sordid and unpleasant. Crime and criminals must never be glamorized. All stories must be written and depicted from the angle of the law, never the reverse. Justice must triumph in every case. In general, the policy of Superman DC Publications is to provide interesting, dramatic, and reasonably exciting entertainment without having recourse to such artificial devices as the use of exaggerated physical manifestations of sex, sexual situations, or situations in which violence is emphasized sadistically. Good people should be good, bad people bad, without making middle ground shading. Good people need not be stuffy to be good, but bad people should not be excused. Heroes should act within the law and for the law. You know, it's interesting that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The content of the first few issues of Superman were not really that much of a problem until he started becoming popular. just as a show or a property in today's time, or even time before, decades before, once it becomes popular, there is a corporate ideal about what they think it is decent, regardless of what the content of the actual story on its own, the artistic vision, is. And it seems to be almost segmented that these kinds of rules and regulations are designed to, on the surface, facilitate an all ages kind of experience. And by those actions, greater profit without hassle from censors. But it is by that very obscuring that causes dishonest stories. It obscures the good in their efforts to appear wholesome. A corporation will wind up obscuring the good messages promoted within these stories. When you have Superman fighting in the 30s, and understand, like in the early 30s and 40s, comics were not simply, they were a medium just like books or films or movies, in which they told a story in which there are truths, human stories, and these rules were a precursor to come with the Congress trials and, the fallout from Frederick Wertham's book and his crusade against comics as a whole, which would shutter so many studios and publishers of comics. Because understand, there wasn't just action comics, there were romance comics, mysteries, a diverse array of content that can suit whoever chooses to pick them up. So there's a lot more to be discussed on this topic of censorship in comics, and the general idea is clear. The characters were radically altered to better turn a profit without being hassled. The long-term effects affected more than just Superman, Batman, or Wonder Woman, but the comics industry as a whole. And on the side, I'd like to give a shout out to the YouTuber Tex for his wonderful video, Does Batman Have a No Killing Rule? Comic book censorship, where I first learned of Whitney Ellsworth's censorship enforcement and the memo in the 1954 Congress hearings. The link to his video is in the description below as well. When people talk about Superman or any kind of lead character in the superhero genre, the discussion of what a hero is always comes up. What are the qualities of a hero? What does a hero behave like? What does a hero not behave like? Are superhero stories only allowed to be quartered into the realm of solely escapism? A space to not think critically or at all? No room for reflection or variety in storytelling? Formed by forgettable characters, negligible situations, and non-existent stakes or consequences in an effort to not offend, misguide parents, politicians, public figures who apparently are only looking out to protect the moral spirit of the children.
No, stop. Think of the children.
And are not just looking out for their own self-interest.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
What kind of an example are we setting?
From comics in the golden age, the late 30s to 1950s, comic books were read by everyone, kids and adults alike, with their circulation numbers being at their peak. Like Detective Comics group sales for July 1938 were $494,136. Adjusted for inflation, that comes out to $9,119,752.99. That is insane. This is something I'll come back to in a later video. However, I placed a link to a thread about the circulation numbers cataloged by the years for the golden age of comic books, 1938 to 1950, in the description below. Let's look at some definitions of the words superhero, hope, and optimism. To explore, ruminate some ideas as to why there is such a fractured public image of Superman and by extension superheroes amongst the general audience and artists alike. The word hero in modern terms is defined as a mythical or legendary figure of divine descent endowed with great strength or ability. Second, an illustrious warrior. Third, a person admired for achievements and noble qualities. Fourth, one who shows great courage. The word super is defined as very good or pleasant or excellent. So, superhero in these terms could mean a pleasant person who shows great courage. Ooh, that sounds pretty accessible, doesn't it? Or a divine, legendary figure, a noble warrior of admirable achievements endowed with great strength and courage. That's a tall order, I'll tell you what. Obviously, when most think of the word, they think something along the lines of courageous, noble people who have extraordinary physical or supernatural abilities. Or a dude or a dudette with cool powers who saves people. Yeah, that's probably it. But let's keep going here. Hope is defined as to cherish a desire with anticipation, to want something to happen or be true. Optimism is defined as an inclination to put the most favorable construction, the act or result of construing, interpreting, or explaining, upon actions and events, or to anticipate the best possible outcome. So these are more designed, these are more in line with perspective and emotional content. Less so their disposition, less so than simply the act of just seeing bright colors. It's less the description, is more of a demeanor. So these two words don't exist in necessarily solely a upbeat context. Okay, if you have a check that is late to direct deposit and it's like a day late, and it is within your desire, that your hope that it arrive is simply a holiday delay and that it will come in on time for you to pay your rent. That is a combination of hope and optimism, and in not an over-the-top context, if that makes sense. So it doesn't have to be presented as solely in one context, solely as an upbeat context. It can be more demure. It can be more subdued. It can be like, these can be delivered differently. And I think there's a misinterpretation that this hope and optimism needs to be defined and seen as solely as one narrow particular feel, one narrow particular depiction, and that, I believe, is hurt. It hurts storytelling, but it's hurt particularly the superhero genre, because it really takes away the kinds of stories that can be told, and not just simply not being told simply as just in a gratuitous fashion. Like, this isn't what this is about. And that's not what, that's kind of what those rules misinterpret. And maybe even Ellsworth himself didn't believe in them, but it goes back into that whole, marketing for profit. And that even if these stories are telling very earnest, or nothing is being used needlessly, Superman in those other accounts was not glamorized. Like, his killings weren't glamorized. They were, and this is another topic entirely, regarding the perspective, the pop culture perspectives, and the nature of life and death and morality. in story depiction, and that's more of a philosophical debate, or rather discussion, because it is ongoing, and they do need to be explored in these kinds of mediums. Sadly, they're not really allowed to be gone into deeply, because for fear of offending or rather offending parents who may be feeling that these are harmful or scary, or like a scarring kind of a reality, regardless of how the story is delivered. And that's an entirely different topic. That's a good topic, but why does all this matter? Like, why put up all these definitions? To sound bougie and show off my enjoyment of the dictionary? Maybe a little bit. But really it matters because audiences and artists' personal ideals, philosophical beliefs, and understandings of those words and their meanings shape the way these stories are created and are delivered to the public. We affect the stories we experience from a creative and business perspective, positive and negatively. The idea that hero has come to mean an individual of nearly absolute success, no failure, and flawless character, always saves the girl, rarely if never suffers defeat. I understand this is a profitable style of storytelling, and there is a place for all sorts of stories. There is a need for variety. However, this narrow range muddies and distorts the concept of what a hero is. This isn't to argue that the standards of heroism should be lowered and thrown around needlessly. There are levels to this. So when it comes to Superman and his depiction, he's in an odd space where he's not really allowed to be a character with layers in his personality and conduct, but rather written more as a character symbolic of bizarre, expanded interpretations of heroism, hope, and optimism. Treated as a god, a supreme divine being of ultimate power, when there's nothing in his lore that actually places him anywhere near that description. He's not an all-knowing entity of ultimate wisdom. He can't use magic and is quite vulnerable to it. Superman is not a divine figure of any kind. He's just very strong physically. Yet pop culture treats him as if he's Jesus Christ, Moses, Buddha, or Allah. And through this image mismanagement for profit, becomes a symbol of absolute compliancy, an agent of Big Brother, the government, that people project their anger of authority upon, regardless of the fact that Superman's very nature is anti-establishment, pro the people. There's a scene in the film The Founder, which tells a story about the history of Roy Kroc McDonald's and the McDonald's brothers, where Kroc is laying out his vision for how he sees McDonald's. How when he was driving all across America to get to California to see the brothers, the common things he kept seeing in all the cities were courthouses with flags on top and churches with crosses on top. Flags, crosses, crosses, flags. The idea he was pushing was McDonald's could be a place that symbolizes where people get together, commune, bond, spiritually, patriotically, and it ain't just open on Sundays, folks. You're not just buying a hamburger, you're buying a piece of the American dream. Imagine that. A burger joint selling the ultimate American ideal to get people to feel great about buying their food. It's a powerful sell, I'll give him that. And that same sell is exactly what was happening to the Man of Steel himself during that wartime in the 1940s. And quite a few other characters as well. He didn't even start saying truth, justice, and the American way until during World War II, when they changed the opening, fighting for truth and justice, on his radio show to what has been come to known as, quote, his catchphrase today. So when are we going to see that these constrictive, arbitrary rules are less about heroic ideals, compelling tales, or how Superman should be portrayed, and more about marketing an idea of patriotism for profit? about people avoiding feelings and thoughts they don't want to feel at the expense of truth and art. What's important to understand is that not all audiences will connect with our work, and that's okay. Not all stories are meant to be for everyone, but there will be stories we will connect with. But that doesn't make us enemies. We don't have to wage an entire campaign against versions of characters we may not like, but instead can celebrate the stories we do enjoy and let others do the same. And perhaps through that celebration and enjoyment, people can understand why we feel the way we do, and in fact, maybe start the seeds to understanding each other a little better. When we make each other miserable for what we don't enjoy, harmony can't be had. You prefer the Superman from Kingdom Come? Cool. The wacky Silver Age Superman? Fun. You enjoy the stoic demeanor depicted in Superman the Animated Series? And the Fleischer Superman animated series? So do I. Maybe you gravitate towards the more thoughtful, earnest, introspective nature of Superman from Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and the upcoming Zack Snyder's Justice League. I know I do. The hardy, take-no-nonsense Golden Age Superman? You already know what it is, fam. Something else to consider in this is, if you don't find what you're looking for in the stories around you, movies, comic books, music, novels, spoken word, make them yourself. Truly, a lot of stories, a lot of good stories are created that way. The Simpsons, Married with Children, and the like were satires made in response to the more positive, surface level, upbeat shows of the 80s. The family sitcoms of the 80s, where a certain depiction was more favored. Their sponsors and again studios were not allowed to go into more nuanced, heavier topics, or just topics where discussion could be started. Real conversation starting episodes. They didn't like what they saw and wanted to tell the stories which reflected more of their worldview. You can do the same. We all can do the same. The best part, it's on your terms. You decide what goes in, what matters. Free of any kind of corporate or studio meddling. You can take it, you can publish it yourself, you can put it online, you can pitch it to a studio if you like. But if you choose to do so, understand you're playing by their rules at that point because of just how the industry is currently set up. So, but if the story succeeds, great, high five for you. If the story's failed, then at least you know why, and it's still on your terms. So if there's anything taken from this very brief leaflet overview of Golden Age Superman and censorship in comics in the late 30s, it should be that in whatever media and whatever art you consume, there's a reflection of history in it. How it changes, how it is altered, independently or in a corporate context. And the ethereal nature of intention will always be an interesting topic, and it will always be something to consider because it does affect us. Art affects life, life affects art. Those effects in art find its way into pop culture, into the popular culture of a given era, and that influences the day-to-day lives of people. That it plays a role in any kind of meaningful cultural change and ideas of exposure, and not even necessarily ideas of exposure by agreement with ideas, but simply the presentation can start conversations. It plays into kind of the idea of, by consistent exposure, it normalizes at least immortalizes the visual of a particular topic from life or philosophical being shown, and the general public who are exposed to this, by way of just their way of experiencing art, are inoculated to this thing, even if, regardless of what the feelings are, positive and negative. And that while an enjoyment of a version can be good, there's nothing wrong with characters being presented as things, avatars of hope. But it's understanding that avatars of hope can come in many different forms, and that's really the advocacy, at least being presented in this video, that there needs to be a variety in different ways of presenting hopeful ideals, because everyone understands things a little differently. Think of how many songs about loneliness, happiness, anger there have been made. There's a litany of them. There's many songs, the idea there's nothing new under the sun, so to speak, in a particular context. Sometimes one person hears it may not resonate with the next person, and that next person needs to hear it differently. Same message said 4 different ways. And that's important because it can get to different people, and hopefully it can get those people who understand differently to better understand each other, as opposed to narrowing down and closing and clamping down any diverse array of explaining an idea or presenting the arts, because for profit, for fear of misunderstanding or harm of quality of business or life. Basically, tell the stories you want to tell, experience the stories you want to tell, love them honestly, and tell people about them, and let story be the device to bring us closer together, to understand each other, and hopefully make the world just a little bit better.
You're looking good, warriors. All the way back to Coney. You hear me, babies? Good. Real good. Adios.